Practical Anarchy, A Guide to Self-Determination, Dickie Dredd. And this is the second part that I said I would do about the Second World War not being an excuse for regime change or an example of good regime change. But let's take it forward. So, preventing the Second World War and responding without regime change. In the Second World War, it is often evoked as the ultimate justification for regime change. It is worth asking a more uncomfortable question: what conditions produced it, and how might it have been prevented or addressed without producing the logic of authoritarian power? From an anarchist perspective, this requires shifting attention away from individual leaders and military inevitability and towards the political, economic and institutional structures that made catastrophe possible. So how the Second World War could have been prevented. And of course a lot of this is theoretical but and my opinions, but I have used various resources to look at this, and I don't think it's completely unfeasible. So, the rise of Nazism was not an historical accident, nor the product of a uniquely malevolent individual. It was the outcome of intersecting crises deliberately managed and mismanaged by states. First of all, the punishment logic of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles was not a peace settlement, but a destabilisation programme. It imposed collective punishment on German society through territorial loss, military restrictions and unpayable reparations. This approach did not weaken authoritarian tendencies, it fertilised them. An anarchist critique rejects the idea that social order can be restored through humiliation and economic strangulation. Reparative justice, debt cancellation and material reconstruction would have undercut the grievance politics and Nazism exploited. Instead, the Allied states chose punishment, ensuring that resentment would be channeled by the most ruthless political actors available. Secondly, the deliberate tolerance of fascism by elites. Nazism was not initially opposed because it was violent or anti-democratic, but because it threatened elite interests, and only once it clearly did so. For years, German industrialists, landowners and conservative politicians supported or tolerated Hitler as a bulwark against socialism and labour movements. Internationally, fascism was often viewed as a regrettable but useful stabilising force. British and French elites feared worker uprisings more than authoritarian nationalism. An anarchist response would have identified fascism early, not as a cultural aberration but as a counter-revolutionary project, and opposed it through transnational labour solidarity rather than diplomatic appeasement. Thirdly, the suppression of grassroots resistance. The German left was fragmented, criminalised and violently repressed long before Hitler consolidated power. Trade unions were destroyed, mutual aid networks were dismantled and autonomous organising outlawed. Once these structures were gone, resistance became exponentially harder. Prevention would have required international support for workers' organisations, refugees, dissidents and underground networks, not respect for state sovereignty, while repression proceeded internally. Anarchism prioritised horizontal solidarity over diplomatic neutrality, recognising that non-interference often functions as complicity. Economic collapse, treated as a policing problem. The Great Depression was managed through austerity, nationalism and broader control, rather than material security. Mass unemployment and social despair were treated as threats to order rather than conditions requiring collective care. An anarchist response would have centred food security, housing, shared resources and mutual aid across borders. Where states responded to crisis by fortifying authority, an anarchist approach would have diffused power and stabilised life directly. Addressing the war without regime change logic. Once war has begun, the options narrowed. But even then, the dominant response was not the only possible one. Firstly, distinguishing defence from domination. From an anarchist perspective, resisting invasion and extermination is legitimate. What is rejected is the transformation of defence into total war and political re-engineering. Localised defence, protection of civilians, evacuation corridors, refugee support and resistance networks could have been prioritised over mass bombing campaigns and civilian annihilation. The deliberate targeting of cities was not a military necessity. It was a political choice rooted in state logic. 2. Supporting internal resistance rather than external control. Germany contained extensive underground resistance. Communists, anarchists, social democrats, religious dissidents and deserters. These movements were under-resourced and often mistrusted by Allied governments, who preferred total victory to unpredictable popular upheaval. An anarchist response would have prioritised arms, intelligence and safe passage for internal resistance, rather than planning for post-war occupation. The aim would not have been to replace one ruling apparatus with another, but to fracture the regime from below. Thirdly, rejecting civilian annihilation as strategy. The firebombing of cities and the atomic destruction of Japan were justified as war-ending necessities. In reality, they entrench the idea that civilian lives are expendable instruments of state objectives. An anarchist ethics rejects this categorically. Violence may occur in defence, but it cannot be legitimised through abstraction. The moment entire populations become targets, the war ceases to be about survival, becomes an exercise in domination, indistinguishable from the violence it claims to oppose. Fourthly, ending the war without sanctifying the state. The post-war settlement entrenched state power globally. Military victory was converted into permanent security architectures, nuclear deterrence and proxy conflicts. Population was demobilised politically even as the world was militarised indefinitely. An anarchist response would have treated the end of the hostilities as an opportunity to dismantle war-making capacity, not universalise it. This would mean demilitarisation, decentralisation of production, abolition of standing armies, and the expansion of autonomous social organisations, rather than the consolidation of blocs. Conclusion. Preventing the Second World War would have required abandoning punishment, hierarchy and elite management in favour of solidarity, material security and transnational resistance. Once war begun, a more anarchistic response would have prioritised defence without annihilation, resistance without occupation, and recovery without the sanctification of state power. That these paths were not taken does not make them naive. It makes them clear which forms of social organisation were systematically excluded, and why the same catastrophic logic continues to repeat.